Hello, fellow reader. Join me, I am your host, Sansi. Dive into the world of magic and explore the most stories full of wonder, fantastical delights. Open your eyes and see the parade come to life. Sansi's parade, Sansi's parade. Join the parade, Sansi's parade, parade. Sansi's parade, Sansi's parade. Join the parade, Sansi's parade.
Chapter 15. Carl did the math. The trip down the great staircase of one tower, across the ground floor of the castle, then up the stairs of the second tower would take the friar more time than Van Helsing had, even if he didn't run into any obstacles along the way. God favors the bold, a voice in his mind said, the voice of one of his teachers, one whom he had never particularly liked. Certainly in Carl's life at the Vatican, he had been bold. Some of his interpretations of gospel had been downright revolutionary. And his paper on the real origins of the Church's 10th century Cluniac reform had caused quite a stir in the friary. But this wasn't intellectual courage. This was life and death, his. No, Van Helsing's, Carl thought. That decided it for him. He muttered a quick prayer asking God for strength and then ran out onto the ancient stone bridge that connected the tower to the one that held Dracula's laboratory. The bridge was just over 6 feet across, with only a short railing to prevent him from being swept over the side, a distinct concern, considering the high winds whipping all around. The weather was insane, with lightning flashing and thunder booming and rain pelting him. The wind felt like a malignant force trying to slowly shove him over the edge and into the abyss. Carl knew it was a mistake to look down, but he could not help it. Turning his head, he looked into the darkness hundreds of feet below. Looking up again, he scanned the ground he had to cover, estimating that the bridge was hundreds of yards across. The real problem was that the way was fraught with huge potholes and piles of rubble. Just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, a bolt of lightning struck the base of the bridge on the other side. He took one last regretful look back the way he had come, only to see Igor charging at him. The twisted man was carrying a long metal pole, which he held in front of him as he ran. Carl barely moved out of the way as the pole slammed into the railing next to him. The thing spat sparks and Carl realized it was a cattle prod. Things had just gotten much worse. Once his feet were on the ground again, Van Helsing made straight for Frankenstein and the pod. And was just a second too late. Another bolt of lightning struck the conductor above the pod and Frankenstein roared again. Van Helsing heard Dracula below them in the lab call out in triumph. One more bolt and my young shall live. Not if I have anything to do with it, Van Helsing thought. Then there was momentary silence before Van Helsing heard another sound he recognized. Dracula was transforming into the winged bat creature. He knows I'm here. Well, he had come for a fight. But first he had some other business to finish. He quickly ripped the second and third bands off of Frankenstein's chest. The giant bellowed in pain as the rivets were torn from his breastbone, but he would live. Van Helsing turned to see the huge bat creature hovering close by, Dracula. He had thought the white creatures the brides became were hideous and formidable, but the Count was even larger, much more heavily muscled. Also, the head was far less human, with the face more bat than man. The entire look of the creature was angular, with sharp protruding teeth and red eyes. Its wingspan was over 20 feet long, with deadly-looking talons on the ends of its arms. As Van Helsing took this in, he had the strange feeling that he was looking at Dracula's true form, one completely devoid of humanity. All there was malice and bloodlust. The creature moved swiftly. It swooped down on Van Helsing, throwing him back with its claws. Van Helsing struck Frankenstein's pod and bounced off. An instant later, he was flying through the air, into the skylight, and down to the lab. It was a 60-foot drop, and he hit hard. He was aware of sparks flying, flames billowing, and the incredible fact that he was alive, not merely alive but standing on his feet. In 400 years Dracula had never faced a foe who had succeeded in doing anything more serious than harassing him. Tonight, Van Helsing promised himself, all that would change. Carl immediately backed away several steps from Igor and the cattle prod, but the evil man was quicker than he looked. Lunging forward, Igor swung the prod at the friar's head. Carl barely managed to duck as the weapon struck a pole just above him. Sparks rained down on Carl's back. Turning toward the other tower, he dashed across the bridge at a dead run with Igor in hot pursuit. A 4-foot hole in the bridge and a leap over a nearby pile of rubble didn't even slow him down. After his rescuer pulled the last band free, Frankenstein watched as Dracula, in his bat form, knocked Van Helsing down through the skylight. He had to help, but when he stood up, he was still too dazed from the lightning strikes to be of much help. Before Frankenstein could step away from the pod, he felt a tingle on the back of his neck. By now he recognized the signs and tried to leap away, but his body responded slowly, and before he could move he saw a bright flash. The lightning coursed through him like liquid fire. He screamed in pain as the bolt tossed him into the air and the current surged down into the lab. That is the third strike that Dracula needs to bring his children to life, Frankenstein thought as he struck the ground and rolled toward the edge of the abyss. Though he was strong, his size worked against him, propelling him toward the fathomless darkness. Clawing at the stone floor, he saw he was closer, and then was over the side. Flinging out his hands, he was able to grab onto the edge of the wall. Electrical wire spit out sparks all around him. Still he held on. He would not let father's dream of life for him die. And he owed something to Van Helsing. One of the wires touched him, sending its power surging into his body. Involuntarily he released his hold on the edge and started to fall. It was several hundred feet straight down. Further had made him very strong, but there were limits, he would not survive. Reaching out again, his hand found a wire and clutched it firmly. The wire came loose from the wall, then went taut in his hand. Frankenstein was swinging on a cable, arcing across the outside of the castle like a giant pendulum. Carl kept running, bobbing and weaving as much as the narrow bridge would allow, with Igor dogging him the entire time. Occasionally he would glance to the side to see the cattle prod strike the ground or railing close by, very close by on more than one occasion. Suddenly the friar saw someone swooping out of the sky, heading straight for him. His first thought was that it was Dracula, but then he realized who it actually was. Carl dove to the ground just in time for the giant to swing over him. Igor, however, was not so lucky. The steel cable Frankenstein clutched caught him across the chest and hurled him over the railing. As Igor fell screaming into the chasm, the cable caught on a pilaster that jutted out from the bridge's railing. Suddenly, Frankenstein was whipped into the side of the bridge and disappeared below it. Racing to the railing, Carl looked down to see Frankenstein still miraculously hanging by the wire, dangling just below him, hundreds of feet above nothingness. The large man was slowly losing his grip. He slid down the last 5 feet of the wire. Then 4. Then 3. 2. 1. Frankenstein looked up at Carl and said, "Help me," his voice that of a man forsaken by all others. "You're supposed to die," Carl said tonelessly. Frankenstein grimaced, pain on his face, and a deep sadness. "I want to live." Frankenstein had not been forsaken by all others, not by Van Helsing. The man before him had saved Van Helsing's life and wanted nothing more than to live in peace. And Carl had nearly disgraced himself before God. All right. All right. Hold on. Hold on. Carl put the syringe he was carrying between his teeth and grabbed the cable, pulling with all of his might. It was not enough. Frankenstein was just too big, too heavy. And Carl was an academic, not a Van Helsing with werewolf venom running through his veins. Still, Frankenstein was one of God's creatures, whatever the leaders of the church might think, and Karl had sworn himself to his service. It was time to appeal to a higher authority than even the cardinal. He said a quick prayer and pulled on the wire. It moved, less than an inch, but it moved. Another prayer beseeching God to spare this man who had suffered so much already. Karl asked to become the instrument of God's mercy and will. He found new strength, and slowly but surely he found himself able to pull Frankenstein to safety. The wire suddenly tore loose from the pilaster that held it. The friar went reeling, losing his grip on the wire. He saw Frankenstein swinging away from him, still clutching the line. Anna could barely move. She couldn't breathe. There were iron bands around her throat. No. Hands. Opening her eyes, Anna saw Ayla's face in front of her, the one she wore as the bat creature, terrifying and full of hate but retaining enough humanity to look like a perversion. Ayla smiled. Be happy in the knowledge that I shall weep over your body. Anna watched as the creature's fangs grew longer. Defiance welled up in the princess. She balled her fist, surprised to find that there was still some fight left in her. Anna willed her hand to strike as Ayla leaned down to bite her. Something blasted into the room. Anna thought that Van Helsing had used some of Karl's exploding liquid, but she realized what it was, who it was. Frankenstein was clutching some sort of rope, bursting through the brick and hitting Ayla squarely in the back. Anna went sprawling. She rolled to her knees and stood up. She was alive. And for the moment free. And where there was life, there was hope. Van Helsing was hurt. Blood was seeping from a few places on his shoulders and back, and there were bruises. More than one rib was probably broken. Still, he felt a rush of energy and power. The werewolf venom was doing its work. He felt things falling away. His mission. Karl. Anna. He tried to hang on to her but finally he let her fall away as well. The werewolf's curse would soon be upon him and he knew he must embrace it. Once he started down that path, he knew that he might never return to himself or to her. And he didn't have to survive in the end to complete this mission. He needed to destroy Dracula, to finish the work of Valerius the Elder and remove the Count's scourge from the earth. He had to succeed, or all of God's creation on earth would be lost. The huge winged beast that was Dracula walked through the flames of the laboratory, looking like the devil himself. Then, before Van Helsing's eyes, the Count seemed to shrink. A moment later, Dracula stood before him in his dapper human form. "You're too late, my friend. My children live," Dracula declared. Van Helsing's ears told him the Count was speaking the truth. Thousands of them had emerged from their cocoons, ready to be unleashed on the world. They had been created in their father's image, full of hatred for humanity, and they were hungry. Backing up, Van Helsing tried to buy some more time. Then the only way to kill them, he looked out through a window at an ancient-looking clock tower outside, is to kill you. A look of inhuman confidence came over Dracula's face, one born of 400 years of experience defeating every foe who had ever crossed him in the course of his long life. The Count had centuries on his side, but Van Helsing had a few new tricks that he was certain Dracula had never seen. The changes inside him were accelerating. Ayla lunged for Anna, but Frankenstein pulled the bride back. Anna moved to help him, but he shook his head. "No. Go help Van Helsing." In a swift, powerful movement, Frankenstein threw the bride creature across the room. It looked as though he might actually be a match for the undead monster. Frankenstein looked at Anna. "Now!" he shouted. She didn't move, only looked into the eyes of the man to whom she now owed her life. "Thank you," she said. Frankenstein nodded and turned back to Ayla, who by now had recovered, tackling him. Anna scrambled through the smashed window, hearing Karl's voice calling to her. "Anna. I need some help." Fighting to maintain her tenuous hold on the wall of the tower, the princess looked down to see Karl on the stone bridge. The friar was facing a 20-foot gap in the bridge ahead of him and a 600-foot drop below. The wind picked up, and it took everything Anna had not to get blown off the wall. Now is not a good time, Carl,